Okay, good morning. It's my pleasure to tell you something about the New Age Dietary Intervention Study, and I will also inform you about the changes in dietary intake and about the compliance to the New Age diet. I will try to finish within 15 minutes, so we can have maybe a small discussion afterwards. Well, first I would like to tell you something about the background. Do we have a pointer? Yeah. So as already explained, it was hypothesized that by means of healthy diets we can reduce the inflammaging. And inflammaging is defined as a chronic low-grade inflammatory status which occurs during aging. And inflammaging can impact many organ systems, such as the brain, the bone, the muscle. And by reducing inflammaging by means of a healthful diet, we can also reduce the risk of developing frailty, disabilities, and any other diseases. Now, to test this hypothesis, we have designed a New Age Dietary Intervention Study. And for this, we've recruited elderly participants aged 65 to 79 years of age who were independently living and who were either non-frail or pre-frail. And participants with certain conditions, as listed here, were excluded for inclusion. As already mentioned, the study centers were located across Europe, in Bologna in Italy, in Warsaw in Poland, in Norwich in the UK, in Wageningen in the Netherlands, and in Clermont-Ferrand in France. And the nice thing about these study centers is that we were able to capture the north, the east, the south, and the west of Europe. So we had a nice picture of Europe. Now you see a picture showing the design of the intervention study. Each recruiting center aimed to include 250 participants. And participants were randomized into either the intervention group or the control group. Measurements were performed at baseline, and all participants were followed for a period of 1 year, and then all measurements were repeated. So participants randomized into the intervention group, they had to follow a healthy diet. But what is actually a healthy diet? Here you see some pictures from dietary guidelines from different countries. So this is the Italian food pyramid. These are the guidelines from the Netherlands, from the UK, France, and from Poland. Well, looking at these pictures, you might think that all these guidelines look very different, but what we actually find out is there's quite some overlap in these guidelines. So what we did is we tried to summarize these 5 different dietary guidelines into the New Age dietary guidelines, and we paid particular attention to nutrients that are of concern in the elderly population, such as vitamin D, folate, and B12. But we also try to improve their fiber intake and fluid intake. And all nutrients are listed in this table. Thereafter, we try to translate these nutrient reference values into food-based dietary guidelines, because that's way easier to advise someone. Because if I would tell you that you should eat more polyunsaturated fatty acids, you will probably not know what to eat. But if I would tell you that you should eat more oily fish, then it makes all much more sense. So that's why we made these food-based dietary guidelines. And they are listed in this table. In total, there were 16 dietary goals for this New Age intervention, because we also aimed for participants to use a vitamin D supplement, because we know that it's really hard to obtain an adequate vitamin D intake by means of diet alone. So besides these food-based dietary guidelines, participants also had to consume a vitamin D supplement. Oh, that was too fast. Now, how did we make sure that participants in the control group did not change the dietary intake, whereas participants in the intervention group did change the dietary intake? Well, the control group, they only received a leaflet describing the general healthy guidelines that was available in each country. And we know from literature that providing a leaflet does not really result in any changes in dietary intake. So we assumed that participants in the control group would continue their habitual dietary intake. To the contrary, participants in the intervention group, they got extensive dietary advice and support by trained dietitians with the aim to support and motivate them to really change their diet more towards the New Age dietary guidelines. This was done by means of counseling and by providing tailored dietary advice. We also provided participants with nutrient-rich foods that I will show you on the next slide. And as mentioned, they were given a vitamin D supplement. And this is me working with some participants, one of the many. The products that we provided included olive oil, which is this bottle. Participants also received whole grain pasta as a substitute of non-whole grain pasta. They also received low-fat, low-sodium cheese, and they received margarine. And these were the vitamin D capsules. Now, at the end of the intervention, we wanted to measure the actual adherence to the New Age diet. And for this purpose, we developed the New Age Index, which allows us to rank participants according to their intake, to their adherence to the New Age diet. It's a continuous score based on a previously described diet index, namely the healthy diet indicator. I will not go through this table very detailed, but the most important thing to remember is that participants are given points according to their intake. So they will get more points if they eat more of a certain food that they should, that's encouraged, and they receive less points for foods that they should limit. For example, for fruits, you see that the advice is to consume 240 grams a day. So participants with the lowest intake, they will get 0 points. Participants with the highest intake, they will get the maximum amount of points. And for example, if a participant consumed 120 grams, so half of this guideline, then he would get 5 points. So there's no strict cutoff, but participants will get points ranging from 0 to 10 per dietary component. And here the table continues with the other dietary goals. And for example, for a component to limit, such as sweets and sweet drinks, then the scoring is reversed, because in that case, participants with the highest intake, so above the 85th percentile of the population's intake distribution, they will get 0 points, whereas those with the lowest intake, or close to 0 grams, they will get the maximum amount of points. So that's really briefly how this scoring system works. Now I would like to show you some first preliminary results of the New Age intervention. This is the baseline table, showing you some characteristics of the participants by control and intervention group. As you can see from this table, the randomization worked out quite nicely, because the number of men is approximately equal between the control and intervention group. The mean age is about 71 years of age, and on average, they had 13 years of education. Also, the number of participants who reported that they have ever smoked is equally distributed, as well as the number of participants reporting a history of a disease. With respect to the frailty, we do see a difference, and we think that this could be due to the fact that participants randomized into the intervention group who are pre-frail, they might be more motivated to stick to the trial, whereas participants who are pre-frail and randomized to the control group, they might be easier to drop out because they have nothing to gain with this intervention. So for now, we think that that could be an explanation for this difference. Here you see the same characteristics, but in this case it's stratified by country. And from this table we can see that in the UK there were more women included. In Poland, participant had the highest education. There were also more peripheral participants, as shown by the previous speaker, but they also reported a higher prevalence of diseases. Whereas in France, participants had the lowest BMI, and they also were more likely to have never smoked. So perhaps this is a difference in health status between the countries. Now, these figures, they show you the differences in dietary intake from baseline to follow-up in the control group compared to the, in the intervention group compared to the control group. And on the x-axis you see the countries, and on the y-axis you see the differences in change. As there are 16 dietary goals, you will see 16 figures on the next 4 slides. And the first figure really nicely shows you that in almost every country, participants in the intervention group, they really significantly improved their whole grain intake compared to the control group. For fruits, this was managed for 2 countries. Also for vegetables, we see that participants in 3 countries were able to improve their vegetable intake, ranging from around 30 grams to even up to 60 grams in France, which is a really great improvement, I would say. For legumes, we see that participants in the intervention group in 3 countries were able to increase their legume intake. And for low-fat dairy, we are also able to see improvements in intake, as well as for low-fat cheese, but this was only accomplished in 2 countries. For fish and shellfish, we see significant changes in every country, with greater intakes in 4 countries, and perhaps surprisingly, a lower intake in participants in the intervention group in the UK. And for lean meat, we do not see any significant changes. For nuts and seeds, we can see that almost every country increased their intake. And for eggs, there was only an increase in intake in 1 country, in the UK. Olive oil was increased in 3 out of 5 countries. And for alcohol, there's not that much going on. So maybe it's really hard for elderly to reduce their alcohol intake, except in France. For fluid intake, we can see that almost every country, participants in the intervention group, in almost every country were able to increase their fluid intake. For sodium, there's a tendency towards a decrease, which is an improvement in this case, because we wanted participants to reduce their sodium intake, except in the Netherlands. And for sweets and sweet drinks, there's a tendency towards a lower intake, which is again good in this case. And for vitamin D, we can see that in almost every country, participants in the intervention group more often used a vitamin D supplement compared to the control group. Now, when looking at the overall New Age diet score, we can see that at baseline, this score ranged from about 75 to up to 90. Oh, and I forgot to mention probably that this score can range from 0 to 160. So a baseline score of around 75 is in between, it's not really high. But when looking at the changes at the end of follow-up, we can see that every country managed to increase their New Age diet score, ranging from 10 points to up to almost 40 points in France. That's a great achievement, I would say. So what we can conclude from these figures and these results is that overall we do see a beneficial change in dietary intake. There are, however, some findings that we need to mention. Although in Italy, participants managed to improve their intake for 5 out of 16 dietary goals, we did not see any change in their reported use of vitamin D. In the UK, the participants managed to increase 7 dietary goals out of 16. And there was a lower fish intake in the intervention group. But I think that this can be explained by the fact that participants in the intervention group, they already started with quite a high fish intake, and they did not really change their intake over time. Whereas the control group, they started way lower with their fish intake, and they did increase their fish intake a little bit. So I think that results in a lower intake in the intervention group compared to the control group. In the Netherlands, participants managed to improve 7 out of 16 dietary goals, and there was a tendency towards a higher sodium intake, although this was not statistically significant. And for now, we assume that this is related to a higher nut intake, but also a higher legume intake. And in the Netherlands, people, if they eat legumes, they usually eat it as a canned or in cans, which contains quite a lot of sodium. So we think that that could be an explanation. And in Poland, participants managed to increase 8 out of 16 dietary goals. And in France, the greatest changes were achieved with up to 12 dietary goals that were improved. So for now, I would like to mention that these are preliminary results. So before drawing really firm conclusions, we need to do some additional analysis. For example, we need to explore the characteristics of the participants who dropped out, which were approximately 150, to see if we are studying really, or if we are missing a really specific group of participants. We also need to study the relative changes in dietary intake as a percentage instead of the actual change, because in that way we can take into account the baseline dietary intake. And finally, and probably most exciting, we need to study the associations between these dietary changes and changes in health outcomes, but that will follow in the near future. So to conclude, we can say that following a 1-year dietary intervention, including dietary advice, counseling, the provision of free foods and a vitamin D supplement, elderly are really able to change the dietary intake towards their nutritional needs, and the health effects of these changes need to be verified. With this, I would like to end the presentation, but not before thanking all New Age partners, but also participants for their really nice collaborations and efforts to make this study an enormous success. Thank you.